Glad all of you could be with us this evening. We continue our studies in the book of 1 Timothy. We'd like to turn, please, to chapter 5. We're beginning this evening a new section in the book. Paul continues his instructions to Timothy, things he ought to preach and teach. Chapter 5 begins discussing different groups of people, kinds of people, that in his work of preaching and teaching, Timothy needs to be able to how properly to relate to and instruct these various different people with their responsibilities as whoever they may be. We've talked about elders and deacons before, and then we talked about, of course, his responsibilities as a preacher. Now he's going to discuss various other groups in a congregation. Most every congregation has these various kinds of people, and he's going to teach us how we should relate to them, evangelists in particular, but all of us, how we ought to relate to these people in these various groups. So first of all, let's go ahead and read verses 1 and 2, and then we'll look at some of the further verses. Who'd like to read verses 1 and 2 for us, please? Chapter 5, verse 1 and 2. Who'd like to read that for us, please? Neil, please.
Do not sharply rebuke an older man, but rather appeal to him as a father, to the younger men as brothers, the older women as mothers, and the younger women as sisters, in all purity.
All right. So as we look at question number 1 from our assignments, you see that he's talking about these different groups, and he's using a basic principle here to apply in these different relationships. He talks about older men, talks about younger men, talks about older women, talks about younger women, but the principle that he's using is similar in all these cases. How would you describe the principle that he's talking about here that he should use and that we should use in our relationship to these different groups of people? Debbie.
As family.
As family. So the way that you would expect or want someone to treat your family member, that's how you should treat these various individuals. So the way you would think that you should treat your father, or that other people should treat your father, that's how you should treat an older man in the congregation. The way that you would treat or think that your mother should be treated, that's the way you should treat an older woman in the congregation. The same thing for a younger man. You should treat him like you would want your brother to be treated. A younger woman, you should treat her like you should want your sister to be treated. So that's the principle, and that's good, very helpful, I think, very useful principle. So let's make some applications. What are some applications we would make then in question number 2? We're talking about if you're talking about an older man. First of all, we need to distinguish between older men and elders, as we talked about earlier in chapter 3. How do we know that this is not talking about elders as a men who hold a particular position in the congregation? How do we know that's not what this is talking about here? I'm assuming we agree on that.
I think it's just the language. He just calls them older men. He didn't call them as an officer.
Okay, there's nothing to indicate that it's an office. What else would you use it, Velma?
Well, the second verse says elder women.
Okay, so the older women, that's not an office, and the young men and the young women, that's not an office. So why would the older men be an office? So when you have older men, older women, younger women in the same context and treat the different ones, then you know it's not talking about an elder, even though it's the same word in the original language. Context tells you that it's talking about simply men who are older in the congregation. So what does he say about these older men? How should you treat them, those men that are older, if you run across one? What does it say? As your father. So what is that? What would be some applications? In principle, what do you learn from that? Karen.
Well, I think this, and really all four of them, it's a matter of showing respect.
Okay, so it's respect. All right, other comments? How do you show respect for an older man? How do you treat your father, or how should you treat your father differently from a younger man? that involves respect that it's talking about here, Terry.
When you approach your father, you approach him knowing he has authority over you and has guided you and has been responsible for you. So when you approach him, you don't approach him with anger and with insolence and all of those bad qualities. You approach him with the recognition of his position.
Okay, so these men, again, they're not elders, so they don't have authority as such, but it says, do not rebuke him, an older man, but exhort him as a father. So teaching to say respectfully to him would mean, again, it's not saying that it's wrong to tell them if he's done something wrong, he needs to be told that, but it's how you do it. For example, what would be the difference between how you would tell your father if you thought he was wrong compared to how you would teach one of your children if you thought they were wrong? What would be the difference in how you say it's respect, but more specifically, what would you do differently? Right.
With children, you expect them to obey and to be submissive.
Okay. And so you don't mind saying that, do you? You say that if your child is disciplined, if you do that again, there's going to be trouble. I'm telling you, you do what I tell you to say, what I tell you to. Isn't that the way we all at times talk to our children? Some people in the room can confirm that I have talked that way at times, okay? But you wouldn't talk that way to your father, would you? You shouldn't. So that, to me, that's the kind of, it would be more of a, Dad, I really think there's a problem here. Something I would like for you to think about. Consider, for example, and then you proceed to show what the problem is. So there's a matter of respect is how you approach them, whether you recognize that you don't really have a position of authority, you don't really have the right to demand, but still, if you think there's a problem, you believe it needs to be brought up. I think most of us would understand that kind of thing. Okay, then apply it when you're talking to an older man in the congregation. Sharon.
One aspect of it as well would be whether you are sure you're right. When you're giving instructions to your children, you're usually pretty sure you're right. If you are a young person, like Timothy was, rebuking someone who's older, if you're approaching it from the standpoint of, I understand, this is what I see, the facts as I know them, and it seems to me that it doesn't match up with the scriptures here, but your attitude should still acknowledge the fact that there may be something that you haven't yet grown enough to understand. So that, even if it turns out you are right, your choice of words and your tone should acknowledge that there may be something that you don't know yet.
Okay, so it's more a matter of, would you please consider this? If you can show me that what you did is right, and I'm mistaken, then please show me, but I would like for you to consider this. With an older person, but you don't rarely talk that way to your own child. Okay, so there's a difference in respect in the sense of how you approach them, and I believe that's what it means when it says don't rebuke him, but exhort him, to encourage him, and to recognize that you don't have a right to tell him what to do, but you are concerned about whatever the problem is. Okay? Other comments on how you approach an older man? Okay? Now then, apply it to, let's skip the younger men for a minute, to the older women. What it would be an application or some example of how you would treat an older woman based on the principle here. Terry.
Usually we approach our mother with kindness.
Okay, kindness.
Not just
Demanding something of them, but we treat our mothers more gently.
Okay, gentleness is a good word. And again, rather than demanding or berating them for something, they're more gentle in a more requesting type approach. Okay? Other comments on how you would approach your mother and therefore how you would approach an older woman in the congregation. Now, how about the younger men? What do we learn from it about how you would treat a younger man in the congregation?
He says as a brother,
Oh,
and I guess with talking with someone, a peer, a younger person, you might be more blunt or straight to the point.
okay. So again, when you talk with your brother, you may be there's a certain respect there, but you wouldn't want somebody else to mistreat your brother, to be mean or cruel to your brother. But you would be more direct maybe than you would with your father. You would say, "Oh, come on, Joe, you know better than that." That more of an equal type of speech. But at the same time, you don't want him mistreated. So think of him as your brother, the way you would want someone else to treat your brother. Then that's the way you should treat this person, even though it's more of a equal or peer relationship rather than the respect you would have for a father, an older man. Okay, other comments? Daryl.
When Paul talks about how to speak to the older man and the older woman, he uses father and mother. You might expect that when he talks about how to appeal to the younger man and the younger woman, that he might say, as to a son or a daughter. He doesn't. He says as a brother or a sister. And what you said just a moment ago, treating them as an equal. I think I see a lot of value in parents can be parents, and parents talk to their sons and daughters as sons and daughters. But there's value in like Timothy is this young man, and they're younger people than him, and Paul says treat them like a brother or a sister rather than like a son or a daughter.
Okay, so now the younger women. He says as a sister, but he adds something. He doesn't just say as a sister. What else does he say? Debbie.
With all purity.
With all purity. Why does he add that? With all purity. Debbie.
I think it's to remind us how to treat people correctly.
Okay. So now again, consider this with your sister. How would you want some other man to treat your sister? You wouldn't want him to take liberties, to be suggestive in any way of what he said or did in his treatment of her. You would want her to be treated with respect in that sense. And I think that's especially the emphasis here, and especially important for a young preacher like Timothy, or any man in the congregation, but especially young men, to be careful that you don't take liberties in your relationship with the other young women in the congregation. Okay, other comments, Sharon.
And not only that they don't do anything that's wrong, but they need to be careful of the appearance. Their choice of when and where to meet or something like that doesn't give the wrong impression to anybody.
Okay, comments? Frank.
Not verbally abusive or berating or putting them down because they're a woman.
Okay, all right. So you might. Oh, I'm not. I didn't laugh because I disagree. I laughed because I saw the point. And again, a difference between how you would treat your mother and how you treat your sister. Now, you might treat your sister more as an equal, kid her and joke around with her and so on in ways that you might not do with your mother. But at the same time, there needs to be a respect there. You want other men to treat your sister with respect. So you treat the other sisters in Christ with respect. Okay? Back to Sharon's point, though. This isn't exactly the same thing that he's talking about here, but I think to me it's a very important principle for all men and women in a congregation, and especially those who are young. Far too often, I've seen a man and a woman in a congregation who are not married to one another. Maybe they're married to somebody else, but they're not married to one another. And they're going out and doing things, just the two of them together, in what most people would view as a dating type situation, when they have no right to date. One of them's married to somebody else or whatever. That's a dangerous situation. Allowing themselves repeatedly to be alone in a house or a building when there's no one else around. Now, if you say, that's dangerous, a lot of people say, oh, what's the danger? We don't see it. But I'm telling you, time and time again, I've seen it, where it develops into something that neither one of them intended at the beginning. Be very, very careful. You would not want your sister to get involved in an immoral relationship with a man. And there would be situations where you might wonder, now you need to be careful about being with that man in that place and then going out with him alone and that kind of, if you're not married to him and he's married to somebody else. The same thing here. Respect a young woman, but with purity. To me, those are important principles, and while he might not be able to prove absolutely here's the line and it's a sin, it's still wisdom. And these relationships he's teaching us help us to learn wisdom in our treatment of other people in the church. Okay, other comments? Anything else on verses 1 and 2? Anybody? All right, let's move on. And he starts talking about now a different group of people. He's going to talk about these for quite a few verses, and that's the widows. We're not going to have time, of course, to deal with all of it this evening, so let's read. Let's read 3 through 8. We'd like to read chapter 5, verse 3 through 8 for us, please. Bill, please.
Honor widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show pity at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplication and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives, and these things command that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever.
Now, one of the challenges we're going to have in this section, and one that's challenged me a number of times as I studied it, is to understand that there are different groups of widows here, different kinds of widows. He's not always talking about the same kinds of widows. We'll explain what we mean about that as we go along. But in verse 33, he says, honor widows who are really widows. Well, you're going to honor a widow who's not really a widow. Really a widow means something special here. We'll talk about that. But let's back off. First of all, what do we mean by a widow? And now we're discussing question number 3. What is a widow? What's a widow? Daddy.
A married woman who has lost her husband to death.
Okay. A woman who was married, her husband's died. So she has no husband. So honoring such a woman means what? What does the word honor mean in this context, Terry?
Support and sustain.
All right, it's talking about supporting, with helping her meet her needs. Okay? Now, the word honor often has the idea of respect, back to the idea we were talking about before, or valuing, appreciating. But sometimes it has a greater meaning than that, and it has the idea of support, financial support, or helping with needs that that person might have. Can you think of passages that would help us understand that? That's a proper use of the word honor there. Sharon.
Verse 17 says that elders can be counted worthy of double honor, so that's both senses of the term.
All right. So, and you notice if you see the context there at verse 17, an elder is worthy of double honor, and he goes on and talks about don't muzzle the ox while it treads out the grain, labor is worthy of his wages. So the honor there is the idea of financial support, meeting their needs, okay? Other examples? Matthew 15, remember, what did Jesus say about the scribes and the Pharisees when he talked about how that they were following their traditions? What was one of their traditions that they really didn't properly follow? Or they used their tradition to not follow God's word, I guess you should say. Debbie?
The money that they would use to support their parents was to be given to the temple, so they couldn't support their parents.
Okay, so the law said, honor your father and mother. But they said, well, I don't have to do that because I've given money to the temple. So you see, he's talking about not supporting. So honor in that context means support, take care of. But people were excusing themselves because they've been doing other things with their money that they thought excused them. But that shows the meaning of the word honor. It means to support, take care of. So when he, coming back to 1 Timothy 5 here, when he says honor widows, he's talking about helping them with their needs, and especially financially, taking care of them, because being a widow, she doesn't have a man to provide for her. Okay? And now, some widows, even though they may not have a husband, obviously don't have a husband, they may have means to take care of themselves without the need for help, but many of them do. And especially in that society, but in any society, we need to be careful about this kind of thing. So he says to honor them, to make sure that we take care of them. Now, he says honor widows who are really widows. We'll come back to this matter of really widows in just a few minutes. But in verse 4, in the general case of a widow who has a need, who should take care of her, according to verse 4?
Family relatives.
Say it again.
Family relatives.
Okay, family, relatives. If a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. So honoring widows in this case means the children or the grandchildren honor your father and your mother. You take care of your needy mother or grandmother if she has a need, and that's honoring the widow. But that's the first responsibility, and that's an important point. The first responsibility of a needy family member, any needy family member, but especially of a widow, is family. In contrast to what in the context? The family takes care, in contrast to who taking care of them?
Church.
The church, okay. And we'll see that spelled out in verse 16. But there are those who the church should take care of. But if they have relatives to take care of them, then the church shouldn't have to take care of them, because the relatives take care of them. Okay? Well then, back to verse 3, and we're going to return to this in verse 5, but before we leave it. So then what is one who is really a widow, or a widow indeed, depending on your translation? If children and grandchildren, family, are supposed to take care of a needy widow, then what is one who is really a widow? As in verse 3, and again we'll see it in verse 5. Debbie.
She has no children.
All right, now here's one who doesn't have children either. She doesn't have a husband. She doesn't have family. She doesn't have anybody to take care of her. Now that's one who the church can honor, take care of. We'll discuss that some more as we go along, because he's interrupted that idea by talking about the family responsibility. But one who's really a widow is somebody who's completely without support, and somebody has to take care of her. No family, no husband, no children, and so on. Daryl.
Right in line with what you're saying. I always thought it was odd that Paul says, honor the widows who are really widows, or honor the widows who are widows indeed. So, well, you just said they were. But the Greek word for widow here is simply the adjective that means to be bereft or left alone. And so Paul uses the word, honor the widows who are really left alone. It's the same word in both places, but you see why he says it that way. Honor the, if I convert both of those terms, honor the left alones who are really left alone is the idea of that verse.
Okay, and we're going to see it more specifically in verse 5. He breaks it up, so that's a little bit confusing too, but verse 5, now she who was really a widow is left alone in the New King James. Right. So the very idea is expressed there, or desolate, depending on your translation. We'll talk more about it. So, but back now to verse 4. Now we're talking about a widow in general who does have family. Before we get to the really widow or the widow indeed who doesn't have family, here was a widow who has family. very important principles. I believe very important principles in verse 4. But one of the interesting things that I've observed more and more recently, and even in our study of the minor prophets, is how much God has to say about widows and orphans, and our responsibility to make sure that their needs are met. And how upset God gets when people neglect, or worse yet, take unfair advantage of these people because of their dependent situation. So, what are some reasons, first of all, what are some reasons he gives in verse 4 why family members should take care of a widow? There are several reasons here. What are the reasons why family members should take care of a widow? Give me one reason. Terry, is that your answer?
We have the responsibility to return to our parents, to requite them for what they've done for us.
All right. You're requiting your parents. What does that mean? Requite, and Terry's pretty much explained it, but what does it mean to requite someone? Debbie? Repay. So it means to repay. Okay. Requite or repay. And what's the idea of that? Obviously, you're getting at it, but explain in your own words what that means. Why do you, or maybe we ask it this way, why do you owe something to your parents? Why do you have to repay your parents? See.
They're the ones that brought you up and attended to all your needs.
Okay.
When you get older, then they should show the respect.
All right. So all the things they did when they were bringing you up, your food, your clothing, the roof over your head, and the guidance and the care and the love and the instruction, all of that, now, in essence, the shoe's on the other foot. Now, they've got a need, and you have the ability to help them. So where they were helping you when you were young and you were needy, you were dependent on them. That word dependent is important. You were dependent on them. Now they're depending on you, and you need to repay. You need to return the favor, return the love and the care. Okay? Requite. So that's one reason that he gives. And I'll come back to that. One reason that you need to care for your elderly mother or grandmother, if she's a widow, is that to requite. But there's a couple other reasons he gives why we should. What was another reason? Terry.
Well, it pleases God.
All right. God says so. This is what God wants. And that's why he has all these other passages about taking care of widows in Scripture. God believes this is the right way to do it. And there's a third reason, too. What's another one? Debbie.
Something about learning piety at home.
Okay. To show piety at home. Piety means, Steve.
Dutiful respect or regard for parents.
All right, respect. So we're back to the idea of respect, you see. With a God, we sometimes use for God piety, respect for God, but in this case, it's not God, it's your mother or your a family member. All right, so there's three reasons there why the first responsibility for caring for a widow's needs fall upon family. Okay? Questions or comments or discussion on any of that? Terry.
I think it's worth noting that he uses the term parents, not just your mother.
Okay.
You have an obligation to both of the parents.
Okay. Yes. Now, why would it be more likely that the mother would be the one who would be in need?
Women outlive men. Women outlive men.
Okay. And that's typically the case, isn't it? That's the way it goes. Tough luck, guys, but it's true, typically. Not always. But there's another reason, I believe, why more commonly when the Bible's talking about a needy elderly person, it's a woman. Why? Not just because she outlives the man, but because... Debbie.
Women are usually seen as unable to take care of themselves.
Not only are they seen as unable to take care of themselves, God's plan, we're going to see in verse 8, is for the husband to provide for the wife. That's his responsibility. He's the breadwinner. She's the homemaker. That's God's plan. if she's followed that plan, and we're going to see when he describes this widow indeed, that if she's done that all of her life, now she's elderly, she may not have a means of providing an income. Whereas the man, he's all of his life he's been providing an income. Well, if he's without his wife, he can still provide an income. So that's why I believe it's far more often that it's the woman, and not because that's anything, any failure on the part of the women. It's just in carrying out God's plan, it's going to naturally be that way far more often. But I'm glad Terry brought up the fact that it does still apply if it's your father who is in need. All right. Now, spend some time on this word requite. Well, by the way, before I do that, the word grandchildren in verse 4, if any widow has children or grandchildren, your old King James says nephews. If you're using the old King James, you need to understand that's old English for grandchild. That word nephew means grandchild in your old King James, if that's what you're using. And that even the lexicons point that out. The word here actually means grandchild. But the old King James translated nephew. That's one of the examples of the very old meaning of a word in the King James, which has changed so much. All right. Now, requiting. What are some things we can learn? Question 7. What are some ways that this principle of requiting your parents can help you when you're making decisions about taking care of an elderly parent? When my parents became elderly and I had responsibilities, and it turns out my sister had passed away and I was the only one, this principle of requiting taught me a lot, I hope, a lot of important principles about dealing with my father and my mother. How does understanding the requiting or repaying your parents help you in understanding how to deal with an elderly parent when you're taking care of them? Debbie.
Their health. If they're healthy, you do one thing. If they're not healthy, you have to consider other options.
Okay. All right. Maybe we need to enlarge on that. Other comments? Karen.
Well, I think it also involves meeting their needs in a respectful, kind way, but not necessarily, it might not necessarily be exactly in the way they want.
Okay. All right. Other comments? Sharon.
I think this one might be a little more difficult for some in our society, but the Bible assumes that parents, especially mothers, personally are taking care of their children's needs and not just shipping them off to a daycare just because they don't want to have to do it themselves. I'm obviously not talking about exceptions or anything, but as much as possible, the Bible expects parents to do for their children personally what they can. And I think the idea of requiting here would assume that for our parents, we do for them what we can personally. And we can't do everything for them personally, but we do what we can for them.
Okay. All right. So, for example, when I asked a question in regard to that, what about putting them in a nursing home? When I was quite young, I used to preach quite frequently about the mistake, the error of putting your parents in a nursing home. And I ended up putting up both my mother and my father in a nursing home before it was over. And the principle that Karen and Sharon have been describing comes into play. When you are raising a child, who gets to decide, who's going to make the decisions about where that child's going to live, how their needs are going to be met, and so on? Who makes those decisions when you're raising the child?
Mom and Dad.
The parents do, right? The parents. The ones giving the care. They're the ones who have to make the decisions about how the care is going to be given, where it's going to be given, and so on. But when you're a kid, you don't say, "Oh, I want my own apartment and you have to provide me one." It's not going to work that way, is it? Not likely. If you get a job, you provide your own apartment, fine, but we just can't do that. We've got other responsibilities. We've got a half a dozen other kids here. we got other things to do. We can't just do just whatever you want. When you were being raised by your parents, the ones who give the care were responsible for the decision. Now they were to make those decisions with love, but they were to consider the whole situation, everybody involved, which meant you oftentimes wouldn't get just the way you wanted things done. But what happens often with elderly parents is they have been independent so long that it's so hard for them now to realize that they are dependent. And that they have to accept the fact that other people are going to make decisions for them that they, for all these years, have made on their own. And you as a child have been so used to respecting your parents, obeying them when you were young, and certainly not telling them, sorry, Mom and Dad, we're not going to do that. I know that's what you want to do, but we're not going to do that. Back to speaking respectfully to your parents, that's tough. Oh, I'm telling you, I remember. Oh, do I remember? The times I had to talk to my dad when he got elderly and tell him, it's not going to be that way, Dad. It's going to have to be this way. Because I just didn't talk that way to my dad. But I had to. I had to requite him. The shoe was on the other foot now. I had to make decisions about his care, which he didn't like. But I was convinced it was for the best for him and everybody else. Requiting. You see, I was repaying. I was doing for him like he would have done for me when I was young. And sometimes that means putting in a nursing home. Because there's sometimes with a child who's sick or whatever, you can't take care of them. You have to put them in some kind of institution, either a hospital. I've even personally known people who had a child with such a serious problem that he had to be put in an institution permanently. Well, sometimes you have tough decisions, but sometimes you have to do that for a child, and sometimes you have to do that for an elderly parent, too. You are requiting them. It's not a lack of love. It's not a failure to honor. It's just that you're giving the care. Now you have to make the decisions about how the care is going to be given, where it's going to be given, and take the whole situation, your other responsibilities, because maybe you're still working on a job, you still got other children to take care of, other responsibilities. The doctors told Harold and me about my dad. He said, if you don't have to sleep at night, you can take care of him at home. But if you need to sleep at night, he needs 24-hour care. If you need to sleep at night, you need to put him in a nursing home. It reaches that point sometimes. That's okay. Obviously, this is something that has impacted me. Hopefully, these thoughts may be helpful to you too. Because it's not necessarily a matter of cruelty to tell your elderly parent, I'm sorry, Mom or Dad, you're not going to be able to live in your house anymore where you've lived for all these years. You're not going to be able to live, we're not going to be able to provide you with your own apartment. If you want to come and live with us, we'll give you a bedroom, you can have a room to yourself, or even try to get you maybe another room for a living area, but that's all we can do. We can't just give you just whatever you want anymore. Okay? Obviously, as I said, this has impacted my thinking. Other comments on you? Thoughts or comments, Karen?
Well, it's not only hard on the elderly parent to realize they're in a situation and to accept it, but when you and I were in the early years of our marriage, I always envisioned if our parents really got needy, they would come live with us. Always. That was always the standard. But you can't imagine at that point in your lives them ever getting so bad that you can't take care of them. But it happens frequently, and it's happened to a lot of us in this congregation. Yes. And I know when David's mother had her like a fifth stroke in a row and was absolutely bonkers. And we had to find we tried taking care of both of David's folks at home, and it was disastrous. But when we went to the nursing home that she ended up in, I remember crying all the way home. I mean, we knew we had to do it, and it was a nice place, and they took great care of her. But I remember just crying all the way home because I thought, I can't believe it's coming. But it does. Sometimes it just does. And it's heartbreaking.
Sometimes we talk about elderly people going through their second childhood. And what that means is they're acting like children. Again, they're not. And sometimes they're rebellious. And my mom started throwing things, taking stuff off the walls, and threw her walker down the stairs. She wasn't herself. She was senile. She had dementia. But there reaches a point you just can't take care of somebody like that. And you have to make those kind of decisions. That concept helped me. I hope the thoughts help you too. My point was I was requiting her. It reached the point where she needed more care, 24-hour care, something better than what we could give to her at home. There's a lot that goes into it, but I believe that those are principles that to me are very, very important. Other comments on verse 4, other discussions on the idea of repaying your parents, or any other comments on verse 4? All right, I hope the thoughts were helpful to you. All right, so now verse 5, we're talking more about one who is really a widow. That is, a widow indeed, depending on your translation. And we'll share with this next time. So be prepared on verse 5 and verse 6 to identify one who is a widow indeed. And you see, it's not just every widow. There's some certain specifics of a widow indeed, and that he talks about. And then in verse 9, he's going to be talking about a different group of widows taken into the number. That's a certain group of widows indeed. So you've got widows in general. Then you've got certain kinds of widows who are widows indeed, or widows left alone, widows who are desolate. And then in that group, you have widows taken into the number, which is an even more specific group. Okay? So look at those as we study for next time, beginning in verse 5. And we'll try to identify these different groups and the qualifications, the characteristics. And as you do think not only of applications to caring for widows, but what do we learn about women? And the responsibilities of women in these passages. And what do we learn about men and the responsibilities of men in these passages? And we'll take up with that then next time. Thank you.